I am one with the gods immortal. I am Nero, the artist, who creates with fire that the dreams of my life may come true.
We're not trying to rehabilitate Nero. He was a vain, self-glorifying and petulant man who possessed neither the wisdom nor the self-restraint to be a good ruler. However, there is strong evidence that Nero has been unfairly vilified and as a result dehumanized. Three things are important to bear in mind here. 1. We shouldn't take the sources at face value. 2. We should resist from calling what we might consider evil action as irrational or proof of an absence of compassion, in other words, psychopathic. 3. We should focus on what was common practice or acceptable in Nero's time. Only then can we truly judge him by the standards of the time and not by the standards of today. Once again, we turn to his childhood. We've already seen Nero growing up with the terrifying prospects of becoming ruler and growing up under a domineering, suffocating mother. Add to this the violent and cutthroat personalities of his ancestors and the Roman tradition to emulate one's forebears. Again, you have the groundwork for an unstable mind. And Nero might not have received much gratification in his youth. It's quite possible he never even wanted to rule in the first place. Through his mother's maneuvering, by 13 he was adopted as Claudius's heir, forced to marry his adoptive sister, Claudia Octavia, whom he clearly didn't love, and his passions for the arts and sports were suppressed. In this light, the death of his mother must have been a complete psychological liberation. You can see how it could go from there. His desires and passions were allowed to go unfettered, and a carefree attitude to life snowballed into a complete abdication of responsibility, accompanied by an erratic, paranoid temperament and worrying disregard for human life. To understand the extent of Nero's tyranny, it's important to run through some of the charges laid at his feet, the events of his life that led to him being labelled as a tyrant. Only then can we begin to try to understand Nero. So without further ado, let's take a closer look at some of his most infamous, reprehensible acts. Charge number 1. The murder of his stepbrother Britannicus in early 55 AD. The ancient sources give us the events leading up to his assassination. During the Feast of Saturnalia that year, Britannicus and Nero were playing a game with a group of their friends. In the game, Nero was the person chosen to give the other players orders. However ridiculous or harmful these orders were, the other players had to obey them, kind of like a truth or dare but without the truth. Nero picked Britannicus to sing a song, secretly hoping, we're told, that Britannicus would make a fool of himself. Britannicus' performance, however, was passable. This alone would have been enough to trigger the petty artist in Nero, but it backfired even more. Britannicus sang a poem of his misfortune about how he had been cast aside by his father Claudius in favour of Nero. Nero, we're told, was completely humiliated, and Britannicus won the sympathy of the rest of the group. This, we're told, was the turning point after which Nero began plotting his stepbrother's murder. This was a short-term cause. A long-term cause was Agrippina. She had been alienated by Nero and his inner circle, and in retaliation vowed to press for Britannicus' rightful claim to the throne, after all her efforts to secure it for Nero. Therefore, killing Britannicus also meant depriving Agrippina of one of her most valuable trump cards. Britannicus was poisoned several months after his fateful performance. Tacitus tells us Britannicus was given a hot drink, which had been tested by a food taster. Britannicus found it too hot. When he asked for it to be cooled, poison was added into the cold water. The effect was apparently immediate, with Britannicus losing, quote, both voice and breath. As panic set in the room, Nero told the people present that his adoptive brother was having an epileptic fit, and that he had suffered from epilepsy ever since he was a boy. Britannicus died in agonizing pain, and his funeral was held the next day. Returning to how this reflects on Nero, we should be asking ourselves some questions. Does the blame lie solely with Nero? Don't forget the influence that Seneca and Burrus had in the early years of Nero's rule. It's very possible that they supported the assassination if it meant fighting fire with fire and undermining Agrippina's threats to Nero. They might have taken the view shared by Tacitus, which was this. Given the monarchy couldn't be shared and the two princes were rivals, it was inevitable that one of them had to go. Since they had already picked a side and were advisors to Nero, not Britannicus, they might have needed to follow through with their loyalties. The second question is, how bad is this considering the standards in ancient Rome, regardless of universal standards of morality? Well, if you don't know already, powerful ancient Romans weren't particularly shy in killing their relatives if they needed to. Tiberius, Caligula, and Caracalla all spring to mind, and a staggeringly small number of Roman emperors died of natural causes. There was a long tradition of killing one's rivals, and though it obviously doesn't excuse him, Nero was hardly acting in historic isolation. Now, what about killing his mother? This, for obvious reasons, is the part of Nero's life which has drawn some of the most amount of attention. Nero had his mother brutally killed in his villa in the Bay of Naples. If you missed out on the story, worthy of Greek tragedy, I refer you back to the biography in the first video. And if you want an even fuller account, I refer you to Tacitus with a link down below. Just take it with a large pinch of salt. Consider its literary value more than its historical one. Whatever the theatricalities added to it by ancient writers are, Nero had his mother killed, and it is of course inexcusable. For the ancient sources, this was the ultimate turning point in Nero's tyranny and decadence, and the end of the so-called Annum Quinquennium Neronis, the 5-year-long Golden Age. Though it might not have been a political turning point, it certainly would have been a psychological game changer for the young emperor. Let's first look at the lead-up. We've already explored Agrippina's suffocating hold on Nero and her scheming and attempts to control his private life. In the early years of his rule, Agrippina intervened to stop Nero's brewing affair with an ex-slave girl named Acta. She instead forced Nero to remain loyal to Claudia Octavia, Claudius's daughter, whom Agrippina had picked for dynastic reasons. Granted, Nero's adultery was an insult to the emperor's memory, an insult to his daughter, and generally an act of disrepute that would anger the Senate and the masses, all of whom were generally sympathetic towards Octavia. There is evidence, though, that Acta was more than just a concubine to Nero. We're told Nero was prepared to marry the freed girl, and he even bribed several former consuls to vouch for her noble ancestry. There's also evidence that Acta was with Nero in his final days and helped bury his ashes, so it's worth wondering just how much of an effect Agrippina's arranged marriage and resistance to his affair could have had on the young man. Agrippina intervened again several years later in opposition to Poppaea Sabina. For Nero, this was now too much to handle. He was completely infatuated with Poppaea, and unlike his present wife, Octavia, Poppaea had proved her fertility in her first marriage and could produce Nero an heir. Tacitus tells us Poppaea Sabina tried to convince Nero to murder his mother, though we should take this with a pinch of salt. With all this, we get the impression of a submissive, only child, long dominated by his mother, gradually coming to terms with the tension this caused with his virtually divine power. He couldn't indulge his romantic or sexual passions without her interference, he couldn't indulge his artistic interests, yet he was meant to be the most powerful man in Rome. So we have a vain, insecure young man with boundless power and an overinflated sense of his self-worth, who had already gotten away with successfully killing his stepbrother. A boy longing for independence, an unrestrained adulthood, a time bomb waiting to explode. Now that we've explored the progression, the question again is this: was her murder condoned? Nero certainly wasn't the only one who was tired of Agrippina. Several years before her death, Agrippina had been accused of sabotaging Nero's claim to the throne by marrying a cousin, Rebellius Plautus, a descendant of the Emperor Tiberius, in order to make him emperor. Burrus at the time had reluctantly agreed she should be put to death. However, he wanted a proper trial and conviction. The trial did take place, and Agrippina ended up winning it. Seneca also heavily disliked Agrippina, and the two were said to have deeply resented one another. Then there was generally the entire male-dominated senatorial class that didn't like an overambitious, conniving woman using her son as a puppet. They probably wouldn't have considered Nero as fit to rule, but as long as he was in the capable hands of Seneca and Burrus, the empire could be safe from harm. What's not certain is whether Burrus and Seneca actually condoned Agrippina's death in 59 AD. We know that Burrus, who was head of the Praetorian Guard, refused to use his men because he couldn't fathom the Praetorians killing any descendant of the great general Germanicus, Agrippina's father. But then we don't know for sure whether he condoned her actual murder by other means. His refusal, after all, forced and undeterred Nero to go via one of his aides instead, a freed slave called Anicetus. The prefect of the fleet at Misenum, Naples, and an enemy of Agrippina's, he was the one who came up with the idea of a collapsible ship, although Nero by one source was also credited. Whether or not Burrus and Seneca condoned it can never be known, though it's been argued that banishment for Agrippina would have been less preferable for a woman as powerful as she was, since she could still threaten the emperor with rivals. Though we don't know if they condoned it, we know they covered up the story. The government and the public were told Agrippina had supposedly tried to assassinate Nero, but that this was foiled, and she had committed suicide in shame. The cover-up was likely a political obligation on their part to prevent violence or some kind of coup against Nero. Then again, Agrippina's death might have been a welcome development, as it would have meant one less problem for Nero's advisors to deal with. What should be said is that Nero was said to be tormented by a death for the rest of his life. We're told he believed he was haunted by a ghost as well as the Furies, ancient Greek deities of vengeance. He also didn't prosecute people who wanted to charge him with matricide, potential evidence that he felt he was guilty. Finally, historian Edward Champlin suggests that Nero might have channeled his grief through his performances. Nero favoured tragic Greek characters like Orestes, a character who was forced to murder his mother, Clytemnestra, as she and her lover had murdered his father, Agamemnon. In a compelling case, Champlin sees it as Nero's flamboyant way to justify the murder of his mother, a rumour so strong by the time of Nero's performances it must have been on the minds of people in the audience. So, an unfeeling psychopath? Probably not, but a psychologically damaged murderer? Very likely. Now, what about his beloved Poppaea Sabina, who we're told he kicked to death in a mad frenzy? Poppaea was the beautiful and wealthy woman who bathed in ass's milk and who, like Agrippina, had pools of ambition. In January 63 AD, she had borne Nero a girl, Claudia. Nero was completely smitten with his first child. He was equally devastated when she died in April, only 3 to 4 months later. At some point in 65 AD, we're told Nero returned from a day of chariot racing. What might have been some domestic scrap, an uncomfortable wife nagging her overtired husband, ended in tragedy. Nero kicked Poppaea in the abdomen with his heel, inadvertently killing both his wife and his unborn son. This is the story passed down by the ancient sources. There's no reason this shouldn't have happened. However, some historians have cast doubt on the traditional narrative. For them, the story just sounds too evil to be true. That it was a smear by contemporaries to dehumanize Nero as a tyrant capable of both uxoricide and infanticide. Nero was also desperate for an heir, so why would he kill his wife and child? For these reasons, scholars suggest Poppaea and her son might have died in childbirth. But then this is on the assumption that Nero was psychologically stable. He had, after all, not only banished the poor Claudia Octavia on trumped-up charges of adultery, he also had her brutally murdered after crowds in Rome had begun protesting her exile. This was excessive, to say the least. The standard punishment one might expect for a wife that had fallen out of the emperor's favour was banishment. It's a testament to just how dark Nero could go, probably one of the most despicable murders of his reign, and therefore cause to believe he could well have kicked the pregnant Poppaea and killed her by accident. Very few historians, including Tacitus, believe that Nero killed Poppaea with intent. So again, abusive wife-beater, possibly, unfeeling psychopath, unlikely. That Nero was completely devastated by the incident goes without saying. Finding a female doppelganger in the form of a prostitute wasn't enough to replace her. He had to castrate the poor boy Sporus, turn him into a woman, and marry him to somehow alleviate his grief. And mourning for Poppaea was substantial, to say the least. She was given a state funeral. When she died, she was embalmed with spices and herbs like an Egyptian noblewoman, and then placed in the mausoleum of Augustus. We're told Nero burned a year's worth of Arabia's incense production. Not only this, she was deified. A temple was built especially for Diva Poppaea Augusta, and an existing temple was dedicated to Sabina Venus. Throughout the remainder of Nero's rule, she appeared on coins and all sorts of inscriptions. And whenever he portrayed a tragic female figure in his performances, he famously wore a mask depicting her face. His grief, it's believed, probably never left him. So this once again leaves us with quite a confusing picture. It's possible Nero kicked his wife and killed her. If he did, this squares with our general image of an unhinged brute who couldn't restrain his violent impulses. It's also possible the ancient sources got it wrong, and the pair simply died in a miscarriage. Nero's theatrical grief could have been the result of either. Next few charges: scapegoating Christians for setting fire to Rome, burning them alive on stakes and crucifixes, using them as human torches to light up his parties, covering them with the skins of beasts, and letting dogs loose on them to be mauled and dismembered. It's not looking great, Nero. Yes, this is well documented, fairly consistent throughout the sources, and very likely happened. This is the stuff that turned Nero into an antichrist by later Christian writers. Nero needed a group of people to blame for the fire, and he picked the Christians. So why the Christian? The short answer is they seemed like an obvious scapegoat. Most Romans didn't particularly like them. For one, there was an integration problem. Many early Christians refused to serve in the Roman army and take on civic responsibilities. More zealous Christians engaged in relentless proselytizing. They would go around telling Romans that they were heathens for worshipping various gods and not the one true God. They would preach about a fiery apocalypse to precede the day of judgment, where all Romans would burn, but they would be saved by Christ. Unsurprisingly, they gained a reputation for hating humans, and weren't particularly popular for it. Tacitus called the Christian faith a pernicious superstition, which broke out not only in Judea, the home of the disease, but in the capital itself, where all things horrible or shameful in the world collect and find a vogue. More diplomatic was Suetonius, reporting that punishment for the Great Fire of Rome was inflicted on the Christians, a class of men given to a new and mischievous superstition. Given all this, historians have suggested that the fire could actually have been spread by the Christians. Many fanatics were present in the city at the time. Setting fire to a city of heathen vice, which placed more value on their emperor than their one true god, isn't too remote a possibility. It's also entirely possible to imagine contemporary Christians interpreting what was truly a ferocious fire as a sign of the foretold Judgment Day, and therefore wanting to fan the flames. Just as equally, it could simply have been an accident. The fire started in a commercial district near the Circus Maximus, where there would have been lots of flammable goods and reasons for fires to break out. A powerful wind apparently drove the fire down the 650-metre long circus, before raging through the old city and engulfing Nero's new palace, the Domus Transitoria, just beyond the Palatine Hill. But returning to Nero and the Christians, if we consider that radical Christians could have played a role in the fire even today, the people of Rome could certainly have believed it too, and many likely did. They were the most obvious culprits. Even if the masses didn't believe the Christians were directly responsible for the fire, their insult to the traditional Roman gods would have made them indirectly guilty. Romans would have believed that angering the gods had caused the loss of their goodwill and protection, and as a result would have allowed or even inflicted the Great Fire of 64 AD. So, we have death by crucifixion, death by fire, and death by beasts. These were all common forms of capital punishment in Rome. The punishment for arsonists was in fact to be burned alive at the stake. Now, just imagine the people of Rome after the fire. Many had lost their homes and property, they'd seen their livelihoods evaporate almost overnight. Much of the city in which they'd been brought up, where they had lived and worked, had been reduced to ash. The people were angry, desperate and frightened. They would have wanted retribution. The whole thing therefore points to a public execution designed to appease the masses. A devastating crime would have warranted proportional punishment. However, there are strong signs, explored by Champlin, that it was something even more than a public execution. That it was in fact a spectacle, a show, with a lot of symbols. We've already seen how the fire could very likely have been seen by Romans as the loss of divine goodwill. The gods not averting the fire because of how angry they were at Christians, for example. This could have made the burning of the city's temples, which did happen and in great numbers, all the more concerning for Romans, as it could further provoke the wrath of the gods. The theatrical way in which the Christians were executed points to a sacrifice to the gods, to assuage their fury and to give them new light after darkness. Another reason to see this whole thing as a sort of Neronian show is a small detail, found in most works on Nero, but that only Champlin paid a closer look at. The anecdote is this. Nero, at this event, was dressed as a charioteer, and is recorded as walking among the crowds. It seems odd to think that somebody like Nero, at an event as symbolic and important as this, should have just forgotten to change out of his chariot racing gear. Champlin offers a simple explanation. Nero was dressed as a charioteer to represent Apollo. After all, the sun god was believed to have been a charioteer, driven by 4 horses on a chariot he rode around the sky every day. Nero could therefore represent a new dawn, new light and hope after the 9-day calamity that destroyed much of Rome. And the culprits were sacrificed in an extremely symbolic event attended by the masses, a reconciliation between the people and the gods, personally hosted by Nero on his private property. After hearing all this, we should ask ourselves the question, in light of the particular circumstances after the Great Fire of Rome and the standards for capital punishment in ancient Rome, are the admittedly gruesome executions the twisted product of a madman? And now for this section's grand finale, the true extent of Nero's involvement in the Great Fire of Rome. Here is the traditional story of Nero and the Great Fire without any nuance and zero fact-checking. The great cluster myth, if you will. Nero set fire to Rome. He hated Rome, its ugly, winding streets, its tight, overcrowded public spaces, and its shabby wooden houses. Nero, the exuberant, self-loving artist, wanted a new city in his image. He also wanted more space to build his enormous new palace, one that was bigger and better, with a huge 120-foot bronze statue of himself. He couldn't get all this via the Senate, so he bypassed them and just set fire to Rome. Some said he sent arsonists out to do the work dressed as drunkards. Others said Nero set it on fire himself. We're also told Nero sang and played music on a rooftop while watching Rome burn. After the fire settled and hundreds of thousands had lost their homes, Nero built his Nerotopia on the Oppian Hill right in the heart of ancient Rome. Nero wins, everybody hates him, and it comes back to seriously bite him in the arse. Right, now I've got your attention again, let's unpack this properly. It is perfectly true that some facts just are not in Nero's favour. He did want a third of Rome spared for him, so that he could build his Golden House, a colossal complex with connected palaces and fabulous gardens with all sorts of monuments and natural features. He wanted to call the whole area, like a city within a city, Neropolis. The Senate did reject these plans, which to the casual observer could give Nero cause to start the fire. So let's start with the easy stuff. Did Nero personally set fire to Rome? No, Nero did not set fire to Rome because at the time of the outbreak he was nearly 35 miles away at his birth town of Antium. Did Nero fiddle? That's playing the violin as Rome burned. No, because there were no violins in ancient Rome. They were a 17th century invention, incidentally around the same time the myth took off. As for any other type of fiddling, hey, maybe. The man had a lot on his plate. The notion, however, that Nero played music as Rome burned goes way back to the ancient sources. Suetonius and Cassius Dio report, based on hearsay, that he sang on a rooftop and began to sing, in a manner which echoed the burning of Troy. So, did this happen? Well, it's quite unlikely. Both hostile accounts were based on biased hearsay. Plus, their accounts on his dress and even his location differ. Tacitus, always our most reliable source, says it's a myth, and that the myth, by his understanding, was that Nero performed privately while the city burned. It certainly sounds like things Nero could have done, but if he did, it sounds more likely it was some sort of spontaneous outburst in his garden and not an actual planned performance. It's quite normal for humans to see beauty in great tragedy. Somebody witnessing the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 called it a great beauty. Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, recited Hindu scripture while witnessing the first ever detonation of a nuclear bomb. Slightly closer to Nero's time was the famous general Scipio Africanus, who quoted Homer when seeing the destruction of Carthage. Nero, being the flamboyant type that he was, might have done something similar, especially as the fire lasted for 9 days with one hiatus, and we certainly like to imagine he did. Next question, did Nero order the fire? Now, this has been the raging question for nearly 2 millennia. I'm going to spare you the chronology and cut to the chase. It was only in the 20th century when Nero began to be absolved of the crime. There's still a minority voice that claims Nero caused the fire. Champlin is one, but his thesis is unconvincing. Most historians believe it's very unlikely Nero caused the fire for the following reasons. Are you ready? 1. Tacitus, our most reliable ancient source on Nero's rule and a gem for historians, went against the tide of his age by saying he personally wasn't sure whether Nero started the fire or whether it was just an accident. He stated there were some sources, now lost to us, that claimed it was an accident, and some which claimed it was Nero. Tacitus's doubt alone, it's been said, is one of the best arguments for the case of the defense. 2. Rome at the time was a hodgepodge of wooden houses. They were poorly constructed, close together with narrow streets. Few houses had firefighting equipment, and firefighting forces were pretty rudimentary. Fires broke out all the time. 3. It's true that Nero did not like large parts of the city. He found the ancient buildings ugly and the narrow, winding streets unseemly. But if you wanted to destroy parts of the city and bypass the Senate, consider this. Demolishing and rebuilding in certain parts would have made so much more sense than an uncontrollable fire that destroys the city's temples, creates hardship and misery for thousands, and even destroys your own palace. I mean, let's not forget, 3 of Rome's 14 regions were practically flattened. 7 more were affected. This is just too crazy, even for Nero. 4. If Nero really wanted to free up land for his Nerotopia, why would he set fire to the opposite side of the Palatine Hill, where the great new wing of his new palace, the Domus Transitoria, had just been built? 5. The fire ravaged the house of Augustus and lots of important temples. all with great works of art. Many more of the city's great temples were burned, along with their incredibly valuable artistic treasures. Why would Nero, lover of art and admirer of his Augustan ancestors, want to destroy such important artistic and religious heritage? 6. For all the slander on Nero causing the fire to rebuild the city, a complete restoration of the city didn't take place after. 7. Enemies at the time of Nero who wrote about Nero and the fire and whom you might have expected to blame Nero actually didn't blame him. Last but not least, as soon as Nero heard about the fire, he rushed back from Antium and oversaw a colossal relief effort. His achievements were as impressive as they were humane. According to Tacitus, he opened up several parts of the imperial grounds to the homeless and refugees, even hosting them in his gardens and building temporary shelters. He massively lowered the price of grain and provided free supplies from Ostia and neighbouring areas. After the fire was finally put out some 9 days later, he conducted a massive rebuilding program which was generally thorough and soundly managed. Fireproof stone was to be used for new buildings, wider streets and less crowded houses were to be built, incentives were given to private developers, it became law for all house owners to store firefighting equipment on their property. He forbade common walls to prevent future fires from spreading. He also appointed special officers to police aqueducts to put a stop to private and illegal siphoning of water, which was common at the time. So after all this, would Nero really have ordered the fire in light of everything you've just heard? Wasn't a fire just completely counterproductive? Critics and rumour makers would have pointed to several things. First, they would have pointed to Nero's personal ambitions prior to the fire, which had been rejected by the Senate. True. But it doesn't mean this would have led him to start the fire. They would have said that him playing the fire while Rome burned proved his indifference to human suffering. We've proved this was more than likely a rumour, or if anything, a colossal exaggeration. They would also have said Nero's relief and reconstruction efforts involved bleeding the rich and the provinces dry, looting the empire's temples, while Nero the hero could bask in his own glory, saving the masses from the misery he actually inflicted. Yes, it's true, Nero's reconstruction efforts would have been extremely expensive. Nero did loot temples not only then, but throughout his rule. In the case of the fire though, where else was he going to get that kind of money, besides from the elite? And no doubt, Nero would have revelled in being the people's saviour, but that doesn't mean he loved it so much he would have had to burn down the city just to receive that kind of praise. With that cleared up, there still remains one big fat elephant in the room: Nero's Golden House. Yes, the preposterous Domus Aurea, though never completed, was designed to sprawl across up to 350 acres of land in the very heart of the city. To Nero's successors, this was the biggest embarrassment Nero could possibly have left behind. It was a symbol of decadence, laden with expensive marble, jewels, ivory, and all sorts of splendours to satisfy Nero's ridiculous excess and megalomania. It was designed to be a huge landscape complex, mainly on the Oppian Hill in the heart of the old city. So it's not just a palace. Here's what Suetonius had to say about it. So large was the house that it had a triple colonnade a mile long. There was a lake in it too, a sea surrounded with buildings to represent cities, besides tracts of country, varied with tilled fields, vineyards, pastures and woods, with great numbers of wild and domestic animals. In the rest of the house, all parts were overlaid with gold and adorned with jewels and mother of pearl. There were dining rooms with fretted ceilings of ivory, whose panels could turn and shower down flowers, and were fitted with pipes for sprinkling the guests with perfumes. The main banquet hall was circular and constantly revolved day and night like the heavens. He had baths supplied with seawater and sulphur water. When the edifice was finished in this style and he dedicated it, he deigned to say nothing more in the way of approval than that he was at last beginning to be housed like a human being. Now, there is no denying this was ridiculously poor timing on Nero's part. There's no doubt either that on many levels the palace was a monument to his megalomania. Nero loved nice things. He saw himself as an artist deserving of nice things. He thought he was great, and he wanted something set in stone as a long-standing testament to his awesomeness. Fine. However, there are several charges from his critics which, if we took at face value, would make Nero's palace truly the epitome of self-glorification and tyranny. In fact, again, there's room for objection. The first popular charge is that Nero erected a 120-foot statue of himself which towered over the whole complex. The common line passed down the centuries is that his successors reworked the statue to make the features look less like Nero's, but those of the sun god Apollo. We know for sure that the statue was meant to be a representation of Apollo. Very little doubt there. But the question is, was Nero depicting himself as the sun god? I won't go into as much detail for this one, but there's very little evidence, besides a vague source written after Nero's time, that Nero had it designed in his image, that is, with his facial features included. This is backed up by Champlin and other historians as well. There's no proper evidence that the statue was even completed in Nero's lifetime. Statues of this size were usually only devoted to the gods. Nero was a megalomaniac, but he didn't actually identify with a god. He didn't think of himself as divine, and he didn't want others to deify him. We know this because he strongly rejected any divine honours which were offered to him in his early rule, as well as 10 years after. Nero used the imagery of the sun god in his imperial propaganda, but this has widely been seen as ideological and political, the sun being a timeless symbol of life, power, glory, and strength. Another good reason to believe Nero wasn't depicting himself was the potential symbolism of the Domus Aurea. The Golden Palace, with all its natural grounds, could well have been more than just aesthetic. Champlin makes a compelling case that Nero's landscape palace was a microcosm of the Roman Empire, if not the world. The lake in the middle could well have been the Mediterranean, the palaces represented cities, then you have the farms, the wild countryside, the humans and the animals. Overlooking all this from the top of the hill was Nero's palace, with of course a statue of Apollo, the sun, at the entrance, giving light and strength and sustenance to the world. It doesn't seem too far-fetched at all for Nero. He was an artist after all, and remember the symbolism he included in some of his stage performances, especially at Saturnalia, but also in Greek tragedies, using a mask depicting his dead wife's face, or playing roles that could attempt to symbolically justify the murder of his mother. Finally, the second charge the elite had about Nero's palace was that it was an exclusive, private grounds that shut out the people of Rome. Once again, Champlin rewrites the narrative, suggesting that the grounds of Nero's Golden House were far too vast, far too aesthetic, and full of symbols and natural features that it couldn't have been anything other than an enormous public park, not only for his benefit, but for the people of Rome as well. Champlin writes, yes, he treated the whole city as his house, as we know. Yes, he even sought to make the city into his house. But his intention thereby was not to exclude the people, as his critics claimed, it was to include them. This has been backed by several British historians as well. Alright, now we've now gone on for far too long. Suffice to say, Champlin's theory is a good one, and squares with Nero's creative talents, his desires for glory and affection, and his efforts to restore the glory of Rome in his own image, with the people singing his praise. If it also meant giving the establishment the finger, so much the better. In any case, the project was dismantled by his successors and was replaced, among other monuments, with the Colosseum. So, very quick recap. We've seen Nero's lifelong desire for admiration and glorification. Competing and performing was a good, albeit unconventional way for Nero to achieve this. But he also did it with generous, politically naive acts like the abolition of taxation or the liberation of Greece. We've seen that Nero was an obsessive artist and a performer who pushed himself beyond the limits of what was normal at the time. There are different ways of looking at this. The first is, of course, shameless attention-seeking and desire for glory just for the sake of it. Another reason, which is connected, is related to Nero's natural rebelliousness. Rebelliousness against his mother's constraints, and rebelliousness against the establishment, and Roman attitudes towards things he liked and considered worthy of respect. We've traced Nero's artistic and competitive achievements almost directly after the death of his mother. He performed and competed for the rest of his life, climaxing with the year-long Greek Games. It's easy to see this as now unbridled control over his own life. As he immersed himself in a world of artistry and competition, we can see how a world which gave him the gratification he was denied in his youth could seem like a much more exciting alternative to the everyday duties of politics, duties which he might never have wanted in the first place but were forced onto him by his mother. In this light, the Greek tour would have been a very welcome and much needed escape from the pressures at home, the rebuilding of the city and the subsequent relief efforts for the unhoused and the unemployed, the Piso conspiracy, the death of his beloved wife. When the insurrections of 68 AD forced him to return to Rome, it doesn't appear as if he'd really left Greece. He'd allowed himself to be so insulated by praise, whether fake or genuine, and deluded by his own sense of self-worth, that any news that could burst his self-made bubble was ignored or not proportionally addressed. He would have to wait for the provincial rebels to surround Rome before his whole world came crashing down before his eyes. And various historians claim Nero could have carried on ruling. Had he not left Rome, he could have come to an agreement with the rebels. Moreover, after Nero had left, and even though he had been sentenced to death, the Senate was still deliberating the decision to assassinate Nero. Many senators had served Nero's predecessors and felt great loyalty to the Julio-Claudian dynasty. They considered preserving Nero's life and negotiating a peaceful succession with a suitable pretender from the provincial rebellion. The centurion present at the time of Nero's suicide was legitimately trying to save his life and return him to Rome. It's almost as if Nero had to die a death of Greek tragedy. It couldn't have been any other way. And what about Nero the depraved tyrant? What about Nero the madman from plays and films? We've seen how bias-driven rumour and myth have led to great distortions of Nero in the popular imagination. It's likely he didn't order the fire on Rome, and that the execution of Christians was normalised as well as religiously and politically justified. The Domus Awkwardus was extremely poor timing, and no doubt Nero at his most excessive, but it wasn't sufficient a motivation to set fire to Rome. What's more, it probably was not designed to exclude the Roman people. All the evidence of Nero's rule points to his affection for and devotion to the Roman populace, even if these were for reasons of self-gratification. As for the murders of his relatives, we've seen how some of these were sometimes politically convenient, following a precedent, and not extraordinary by Roman standards. The murder of Nero's first wife, Claudia Octavia, is an exception, due to its unnecessary brutality, as well as that of his second wife, if indeed he was responsible for it. There is no doubt Nero had a cruel streak to him, and this was most evident in his abusive and perverted treatment of women or romantic and sexual partners. His unconventional and warped relationship with his mother might have been the source for much of this. That said, Nero doesn't have to be viewed as insane. We've seen how many of his most tyrannical acts, if not rejected as myths, were in fact guided by rational motives or acceptable practice. The ancient narrative of descent into tyranny after his mother's death doesn't really square with the revised history. Nero generally handled the Great Fire of Rome, as well as the Piso conspiracy, with skill, humanity, and relative decency. The Greek tour was politically catastrophic, but it shouldn't be seen as a lapse of sanity on Nero's part, and more an abdication of responsibility. His oblivious and carefree attitude to politics on his return was a huge escalation of that trend, after months of insulating praise and achievement. So who was Nero? A vain prima donna? How about a tormented artist? Or a stunted, petulant child with too much power and wealth? A murderer, abuser, and tyrant, perhaps? Well, he was probably all of those. But he certainly wasn't the Nero of popular legend, and he probably wasn't insane. So what are your thoughts?